When your best friend is dying in your arms, you'll do anything to save them. Jed Crowther knew that feeling as he carried his old dog Bandit through the worst blizzard he'd ever seen. The mountain man had survived 40 winters in these peaks, but this storm was different. It wanted them both dead. Just when his strength gave out, Jed's boot hit something metal buried in the snow. An old hatch, rusted and forgotten. He pulled it open and climbed down into what looked like an abandoned bunker. But the place wasn't abandoned. Someone had been living there recently. The beds were made, food was stocked, and a fire burned warm in the hearth. Then Jed saw something that made his blood run cold. His own name carved into the wooden table. But how could that be when he'd never been here before? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jed Crowther had carried many burdens in his 62 years, but none heavier than the limp body of his faithful companion. Bandit's breathing came in shallow gasps, each one weaker than the last, as Jed gently laid the old dog on a worn military cot in the corner of the mysterious bunker. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his weathered hands trembling as he checked Bandit's pulse. "We're gonna be just fine now." But even as he spoke the words, Jed's mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. How long had he been wandering these mountains? 20 years? 30? The memories seemed to blur together like snowflakes in a whirlwind. All he knew for certain was that one day he'd awakened in a hospital with gaps in his memory and a profound need to disappear into the wilderness. Bandit had been with him from the start, or had he? The bunker itself defied explanation. The concrete walls were solid, professional work, not some prospector's cave or hunting cabin. Military-grade insulation kept the interior warm, despite the howling storm above. Solar panels, barely visible through a cleverly concealed skylight, provided power to LED strips that cast a steady glow throughout the space. Someone had spent serious money and considerable expertise building this place. Jed moved through the bunker with the careful steps of a man who'd learned to read his environment for survival. The main room served as both living quarters and command center. A small kitchenette occupied one corner, stocked with enough provisions to last months. Canned goods, dried meat, water purification tablets, everything a person would need to disappear completely. The sleeping area contained 2 cots, both with military-issue sleeping bags folded with parade ground precision. But it was the third area that made Jed's pulse quicken. Maps covered an entire wall, detailed topographical surveys of the surrounding mountain range. Red pins marked locations that meant nothing to him, yet somehow felt familiar. Supply caches, perhaps? Safe houses? The maps showed elevation markers, water sources, and what appeared to be patrol routes drawn in different colored inks. Near the maps, a wooden table bore the carved letters that had stopped his heart cold. J. Crowther, etched deep into the grain, as if someone had worked the letters with a knife during long, thoughtful hours. Below his name, someone had carved a date. March 15, 2003. The numbers meant nothing to him, yet they stirred something deep in his chest, a recognition he couldn't quite grasp. Bandit stirred on the cot, and Jed hurried back to his side. The dog's eyes opened, unfocused but alive. In the improved light, Jed could see details he'd missed during their desperate flight from the storm. Bandit wasn't just any stray who'd chosen to follow a mountain hermit. His fur bore scars in patterns that suggested training, discipline. His paws were calloused not from wandering, but from specific, repetitive work. Most telling of all, when Jed touched the dog's neck to check his pulse, his fingers encountered something unexpected beneath the thick fur. "What have we here, old friend?" With gentle care, Jed worked his fingers under Bandit's collar. Hidden beneath a flap of leather, his fingertips touched metal. Dog tags. Military identification tags, worn smooth by years of wear. Jed's hands shook as he worked them free and held them up to the light. The first tag bore Bandit's information. Bandit, MWDK 9 Unit 47, DOB, the 15th of May 1999, military working dog. The second tag made Jed's world tilt off its axis. Handler, SFC Jed Crowther, SFA, Special Forces. He'd been Special Forces. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Jed sank into a chair beside the table, staring at the tags in his palm. Bandit wasn't just his companion, the dog had been assigned to him, trained with him. They'd served together in some capacity that his damaged memory couldn't access. "Sergeant First Class," he whispered to the empty bunker. "What the hell happened to us, boy?" Bandit's tail gave a weak thump against the cot, as if the dog understood more than he could express. Those intelligent brown eyes held depths that Jed was only beginning to fathom. How many missions had they completed together? How many dangers had they faced? And why couldn't he remember any of it? The storm outside seemed to be weakening, the howling wind dropping to a steady moan. Jed knew he should be planning their next move, figuring out how to get Bandit proper medical attention once the weather cleared. Instead, he found himself drawn back to the maps, studying them with new eyes. The patrol routes made sense now. Someone, possibly him, had mapped this entire region with military precision. Supply caches, observation points, extraction routes. This wasn't just a bunker, it was an operational base. But for what operation? And who had been the enemy? As he traced one of the routes with his finger, a memory surfaced like a bubble, rising through dark water. Snow, gunfire, the taste of fear and adrenaline. Bandit barking, a warning. Then nothing, just the white void that seemed to shroud everything in his past beyond 20 years ago. "We were soldiers, weren't we?" he asked the dog. Bandit's ears perked up at the word soldiers, another small confirmation of what the tags had revealed. Jed opened cabinets and storage compartments with growing amazement. Whoever had stocked this place had thought of everything. Medical supplies filled one entire cabinet, not just first aid basics, but serious trauma gear. IV bags, antibiotics, surgical tools, still in sterile packaging. Another compartment held communications equipment, radios, encryption devices, satellite phones. All of it looked well maintained but dated, as if someone had prepared for a situation that never came. Or had it? In the deepest storage compartment, Jed found something that made his blood run cold. Weapons. Not hunting rifles or the kind of firearms a mountain man might own for protection. These were military-grade weapons, maintained with professional care. An M4 carbine, disassembled and wrapped in oilcloth. A precision sniper rifle in a custom case. Handguns in sealed containers, enough ammunition to fight a small war. Why would a simple mountain man need an arsenal like this? The answer came with another fragment of memory. A voice, urgent and commanding. "Get him out of here. The whole operation's compromised." Then explosions, smoke, the sensation of running while carrying something precious, or someone precious. Jed's hands moved to his temples, massaging away the headache that always came with these memory flashes. The doctors had warned him that forcing his recollection could be dangerous, that his amnesia might be protecting him from trauma too severe to process. But sitting in this bunker, surrounded by evidence of a life he couldn't remember, those medical warnings seemed less important than the truth. What were we running from, Bandit? What scared us so badly that we had to disappear? The dog struggled to his feet, moving carefully but with determination. He walked to Jed and pressed his head against his handler's leg, offering comfort in the way that only dogs could. It was a gesture both familiar and heartbreaking, because Jed could sense the decades of loyalty behind it, even if he couldn't remember earning it. Outside, the storm was definitely weakening. Soon, they'd need to make decisions about their next move. But for now, in the warm sanctuary of the bunker, Jed allowed himself to simply exist in the moment with his faithful companion. 20 years of questions might remain unanswered, but one thing was crystal clear. Whatever had happened to them, whatever had driven them into hiding, they'd faced it together. and they'd survive it together, too. Jed pulled a blanket over Bandit and settled into the other chair at the carved table. His fingers traced his own name in the wood, wondering about the man who'd carved it. That man had known something, had been someone that current Jed couldn't access, but maybe, with time and patience, those memories would return. Maybe it was time they returned. As if sensing his thoughts, Bandit lifted his head and looked directly at his handler. Those wise brown eyes held a message Jed couldn't quite interpret, but he understood its essence. Whatever came next, they'd face it as they always had. Together. The crackling sound started as a whisper, so faint that Jed almost dismissed it as wind through the ventilation system. But Bandit's ears snapped to attention, his head turning toward the communications equipment with laser focus. The dog's reaction told Jed everything he needed to know. This wasn't random interference. Someone was trying to make contact. Jed approached the radio setup with caution, his fingers hovering over controls that felt both foreign and familiar. The main unit was military-grade, designed for encrypted communications across vast distances. As the static cleared, a voice emerged from the speakers, professional, urgent, speaking in what sounded like code. Blackbird 7, this is Overwatch. Package delivery scheduled for dawn. Repeat, package delivery at dawn coordinates. The words hit Jed like electricity through his nervous system. Without conscious thought, his hand moved to the transmission key. Overwatch. This is... He stopped himself, heart pounding. He'd been about to respond with a call sign he didn't remember learning. Blackbird 7, respond immediately. Your position is compromised. Hostiles approaching your 20. Compromised. Hostiles. The military terminology flowed through Jed's mind with disturbing ease, bringing with it a cascade of tactical awareness he hadn't known he possessed. 20 meant their location. Dawn coordinates probably referred to an extraction point. And package delivery in military speak that usually meant personnel or equipment, or termination orders. Bandit was on his feet now, fully alert despite his recent collapse. The dog moved to the bunker's single entrance, his posture rigid with trained vigilance. Whatever was coming, Bandit could sense it approaching through the storm. Overwatch to Blackbird 7. Acknowledge or, we assume, position overrun. Jed's training, he couldn't remember receiving, kicked in with automatic precision. He quickly switched the radio to a different frequency and adjusted the encryption settings. When he keyed the microphone again, his voice was steady and controlled. Overwatch, this is Blackbird 7. Position secure but monitored. What's the nature of the package? 7. Confirm your identity. State your authentication code. Authentication code. Jed closed his eyes, reaching deep into the locked chambers of his memory. Nothing came. But as his fingers moved over the radio's keypad, they seemed to know what to do without his conscious direction. He found himself typing a sequence, 47392, authentication code 47392, he transmitted. A pause. Then confirmed. 7. Package is cleanup crew. Your extraction was supposed to be temporary. Someone upstairs decided to make it permanent. ETA, 15 minutes. Cleanup crew. The phrase sent ice through Jed's veins. In military parlance, cleanup crews weren't sent to tidy up. They were sent to eliminate loose ends. Evidence. People who knew too much. Understood, Overwatch. Will prepare to receive package. Negative. 7. Package is not friendly. Repeat. Not friendly. Suggest immediate relocation to Alpha Point. Jed looked around the bunker with new eyes. This wasn't just a safe house, it was a trap. Someone had been using it to monitor him, to keep track of his location, and now they'd decided he was too much of a liability to leave alive. The radio crackled again with a different voice, harsh and commanding. All units, target, is confirmed at primary location. Move in, fast and clean. No survivors. Jed killed the radio and moved with sudden urgency. Bandit was already at the weapons locker, his training overriding his recent illness. The dog's recovery seemed miraculous, but Jed realized it probably wasn't recovery at all. It was adrenaline and deeply ingrained conditioning taking over. "Looks like our quiet retirement just ended, boy," Jed muttered as he rapidly assembled the M4 carbine. His hands moved with muscle memory, checking the action, loading magazines, adjusting sights. 20 years of amnesia couldn't erase the kind of training that had been burned into his reflexes. Through the concealed periscope system, another feature of the bunker, he was only now noticing, Jed could see dark figures moving through the storm. They moved with professional precision, spacing themselves in tactical formation as they approached the bunker's hidden entrance. These weren't random hikers or lost hunters. These were soldiers, and they were here to kill him. But why? What had he done, or what did he know that made him worth murdering after 20 years of peaceful isolation? The answer would have to wait. Right now, survival was the only priority. Jed quickly inventoried their situation. The bunker had 2 exits, the main hatch they'd entered through, and an emergency tunnel that led to a concealed exit about 50 yards away. The tunnel was narrow but would allow them to escape undetected if they moved quickly. "Bandit, tunnel," he commanded, pointing toward the rear of the bunker. The dog immediately understood, moving toward the emergency exit with the fluid grace of a trained military operative. Whatever illness had afflicted him during the storm was completely gone now, replaced by the alertness and capability of a seasoned combat veteran. As Jed gathered essential supplies, ammunition, medical kit, emergency rations, the bunker's motion sensors began chirping softly. The cleanup crew was directly above them now, probably setting up to breach the main entrance. He had maybe 2 minutes before they came through that hatch with overwhelming firepower. A memory surfaced unbidden. Another bunker. Another desperate escape. The smell of cordite and the screams of dying men. The image was fragmentary, but it carried an emotional weight that nearly staggered him. He'd been in this situation before. People had died because of him, or because of what he knew. The thought should have paralyzed him with fear or guilt, but instead it sharpened his focus to a razor's edge. Whatever had happened in the past, whoever these people were who wanted him dead, they'd made a crucial mistake. They'd threatened Bandit, and they'd forced Jed into a corner. They were about to learn why that was a very bad idea. The dog was already in the tunnel when the first explosion shook the bunker. Shaped charges, designed to breach the main hatch without bringing down the entire structure. Professional work, but loud enough to mask their escape through the rear exit. Jed grabbed the sniper rifle and followed Bandit into the tunnel, sealing the entrance behind them just as voices echoed through the main bunker. The cleanup crew was inside, searching for bodies that weren't there. "Clear," someone shouted. "Where the hell are they? Check the tunnel systems. If there's a back way out." The voice was cut off as Jed and Bandit emerged from the concealed exit into the storm. The blizzard that had nearly killed them earlier was now their salvation, providing cover as they moved away from the compromised position. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Jed realized this was just the beginning. Whoever had found him once could find him again. The quiet life he'd built over 20 years was over. Now he had to remember who he really was, and why someone wanted him dead badly enough to send a military kill team after him. The radio in his pack crackled. One final time before he switched it off. Target escaped. Expand. Search perimeter. Authorization for extreme prejudice confirmed. Extreme prejudice. Military code for kill on sight. Jed looked down at Bandit, whose intelligent eyes reflected the same grim understanding. Their war wasn't over. It had just begun again. The abandoned ranger station sat like a ghost against the mountainside, its weathered logs barely visible through the swirling snow. Jed had remembered its location with the same inexplicable certainty that had guided him to the radio frequency's knowledge that existed in his muscle memory, even when his conscious mind drew blanks. Bandit cleared the building with professional efficiency, his movements silent and systematic as he checked each corner for threats. The dog's transformation from dying companion to tactical operative was complete now, and watching him work triggered more fragments of buried memory in Jed's mind. "Good boy," Jed whispered as Bandit returned with an all-clear signal. "You haven't forgotten your training, have you?" Inside the ranger station, Jed quickly set up a defensive position while his mind processed what had happened at the bunker. The cleanup crew had moved with military precision, but they'd made one crucial error: they'd underestimated their target. Whoever had ordered his termination clearly believed that 20 years of amnesia had turned him into a helpless civilian. They were wrong. As Jed established a watch rotation and checked their supplies, he found himself moving through procedures he couldn't remember learning. Sight lines, fields of fire, escape routes, all of it came as naturally as breathing. But it was when he discovered a hidden cache behind a loose floorboard that the first major memory breakthrough occurred. The cache contained more than supplies. Wrapped in waterproof material was a photograph, faded but clear enough to stop Jed's heart. 5 men in military fatigues stood in what looked like a forward operating base somewhere tropical. Mountains in the background, jungle vegetation, the kind of humid heat you could almost feel through the image. And there, third from the left, was a younger version of himself. But it was the man standing next to him that made Jed's hands tremble. He was holding a German shepherd that looked remarkably like Bandit, only younger. The man's face was partially obscured by shadows, but something about his stance, his bearing, triggered a cascade of recognition. "Matthews," Jed whispered, the name surfacing from nowhere. "Lieutenant Colonel David Matthews." The memory that followed was fragmentary but intense. Matthews had been his commanding officer, a man who inspired fierce loyalty in his troops. But something had gone wrong. The mission, something about extracting a defector with critical intelligence, enemy contact, betrayal from within their own ranks. Bandit whined softly and pressed against Jed's leg, sensing his handler's distress. The dog's presence grounded him, pulling him back from the edge of memory's abyss. But the photograph had unlocked something important. These weren't random fragments anymore. They were pieces of a specific operation, a specific betrayal that had cost lives. As he studied the other faces in the photograph, more names began to surface. Rodriguez, the team medic; Thompson, their communications specialist; and Parker, Sergeant First Class William Parker, whose face Jed could now remember with crystal clarity. Parker had been ambitious, always pushing for advancement, always resentful of the trust Matthews placed in others. "You betrayed us, didn't you, Parker?" Jed said to the photograph. "But why?" The sound of distant engines made him pocket the photograph quickly. Snowmobiles, at least 3 of them, moving up the mountain trail with purpose. The cleanup crew had tracked them faster than expected. Bandit was already at the window, his body tense with controlled aggression. The dog's tactical awareness was extraordinary. He could distinguish between civilian activity and military threats with a precision that spoke to years of specialized training. Right now, everything about his posture screamed danger. Jed moved to his own observation position and confirmed what Bandit had detected. 3 snowmobiles with riders in military gear, moving in a tactical formation designed to surround the ranger station. They'd found his trail despite his efforts to mask it. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were tracking specialists, probably with the same special forces background he was beginning to remember. "Time to go, boy," he murmured, but Bandit was already moving toward their predetermined exit route. They slipped out the back of the ranger station just as the assault team reached the building's perimeter. Through the storm, Jed could hear them coordinating their approach with professional hand signals and whispered commands. Good. Soldiers following orders, but orders that meant his death. As they climbed higher into the mountain wilderness, fragments of tactical knowledge continued to surface in Jed's mind. How to move silently through snow, how to mask their trail, how to use terrain for concealment and advantage. The skills were all there, perfectly preserved despite 2 decades of dormancy. But it was Bandit's behavior that provided the most startling revelation. The dog wasn't just following, he was actively participating in their evasion, using techniques that no ordinary pet could know. At one point, Bandit actually led Jed to a specific rock formation that provided perfect concealment from aerial surveillance. The dog had remembered patrol routes and hiding spots that Jed's conscious mind had forgotten. "How many missions did we run together, boy?" Jed asked as they sheltered in a natural cave. "How many times did we do exactly this?" Bandit's response was to move to the cave entrance and assume a guard position that was textbook military protocol. The dog knew they were being hunted, understood the tactical situation, and was acting accordingly. Whatever training they'd received, it had created a bond that transcended normal human-animal relationships. The photograph in Jed's pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a tangible link to a past that was slowly, painfully reassembling itself. He pulled it out again, studying the faces of his former teammates. Good men, most of them. Men who'd trusted him with their lives. Men who'd died because someone had betrayed their mission. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The cleanup crew wasn't just trying to kill him to tie up loose ends. They were trying to silence the only surviving witness to a betrayal that had cost American lives. He was living proof that someone high up in the chain of command had sold out a special forces unit for money, power, or ideology. "That's why they want us dead," he told Bandit. "We know, something that could bring down some very powerful people." The dog's ears twitched, and he turned toward the cave entrance with sudden alertness. Voices carried on the wind, their pursuers were closer than expected, and they were using dogs of their own to track their scent trail. Jed quickly assessed their options. They could continue running, but the pursuit team had resources he couldn't match indefinitely, or they could make a stand, but he had no idea how many people were hunting them or what kind of support they had. The third option was the most dangerous. He could try to remember more about the original mission, about what exactly he knew that made him worth killing. But forcing those memories could trigger psychological trauma that would leave him helpless at the worst possible moment. Looking into Bandit's intelligent eyes, Jed made his decision. Whatever risks lay in recovering his past, the alternative was certain death for both of them. It was time to remember who he'd been, and what he'd learned that someone was willing to kill to keep secret. The hunt was closing in, but Jed was no longer running blind. He was beginning to remember that he'd been the hunter once, too. The metal filing cabinet had been hidden behind a false wall in the cave system, so well concealed that only someone with intimate knowledge of the location could have found it. As Jed's hands moved over the hidden catch mechanism with unconscious familiarity, he realized he'd been here before, many times before. "Operation Whiteout," he read aloud from the folder tab, his voice barely a whisper in the darkness. The words triggered an immediate physical response. Sweating palms, accelerated heartbeat, the taste of copper in his mouth. His body remembered what his mind had tried to forget. Bandit pressed close against his leg as Jed opened the first file. The dog's warmth was reassuring, a steady presence in the face of revelations that threatened to overwhelm him. The documents inside were classified at the highest levels, the kind of intelligence that could reshape international relations if it fell into the wrong hands. The mission briefing was dated March 1st, 2003. Operation Whiteout. Extract a Russian nuclear scientist who had information about weapons-grade plutonium being sold to terrorist organizations. The scientist, Dr. Yuri Volkov, had contacted American intelligence through back channels, offering to defect in exchange for protection for his family. Jed's team had been chosen for the extraction because of their success record in hostile territory operations. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews commanding, with Jed as second in command and Bandit as their early warning system. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Insert at night, rendezvous with Volkov at a predetermined location, extract via helicopter to a secure facility. But as Jed read further into the files, a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air settled in his bones. Someone had leaked the operation details to Russian intelligence. The extraction site had been compromised, the helicopter shot down, and most of his team killed in the subsequent firefight. The after-action report was devastating in its clinical precision. Rodriguez, their medic, had died trying to save the wounded pilot. Thompson, their communications specialist, had been killed while calling in backup. Lieutenant Colonel Matthews had taken a sniper's bullet while covering their retreat. Of the five-man team, only Jed and Bandit had survived. But it was the intelligence assessment that made Jed's hands shake as he read it. The leak hadn't come from Russian intelligence gathering or surveillance. It had come from within their own command structure. Someone in the American military had deliberately sabotaged Operation Whiteout, sacrificing American lives to prevent Dr. Volkov's defection. "They sold us out," Jed whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Matthews, Rodriguez, Thompson, they all died because someone on our side wanted them dead." The final document in the folder was handwritten, in what Jed now recognized as his own handwriting from 20 years ago. A field report, written in the immediate aftermath of the mission, while the details were still fresh. As he read his younger self's words, the memories came flooding back with devastating clarity. The ambush had been perfectly coordinated. Russian special forces had known exactly where to position themselves, exactly when the extraction would take place. They'd even known Bandit's specific training protocols, using acoustic devices to try to disorient the dog before the attack began. But the most damning detail was in the timing. The ambush had started exactly 17 minutes after their scheduled rendezvous with Dr. Volkov. 17 minutes, the precise amount of time Sergeant First Class Parker would have needed to transmit their location after receiving their position report. Parker, who had remained at the forward operating base as their communications liaison. Parker, who had access to all operational details and real-time position updates. Parker, who had been conspicuously absent when the rescue teams finally reached the survivors. Parker was feeding information to the Russians. Jed said, the words tasting bitter in the mountain air. "He got our entire team killed for money." But there was more. According to his own field notes, Dr. Volkov had managed to pass along crucial information before the ambush began. Names, bank account numbers, transaction records, evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond one corrupt sergeant. The plutonium sales were being coordinated by a network that included American officials, Russian intelligence, and Middle Eastern buyers. Jed had hidden that intelligence in a secure location before his medical evacuation, intending to pass it along to proper authorities once he recovered. But his recovery had involved memory suppression therapy, supposedly to help him deal with the trauma of losing his entire team. In reality, it had been an elaborate cover-up, designed to bury the evidence of treason that could have exposed dozens of conspirators. "They didn't just take our memories, boy," he told Bandit, whose intelligent eyes seemed to understand every word. "They tried to erase the proof of what Parker and his handlers did to our team. The sound of helicopters echoing through the mountain passes made both man and dog freeze. The pursuit was escalating, bringing in aerial assets that would make hiding much more difficult. But the revelation in the files had changed something fundamental in Jed's thinking. He was no longer just running from unknown enemies, he was the keeper of evidence that could bring justice for his fallen teammates. As he carefully repacked the files, Jed's tactical mind began working through new possibilities. The cleanup crew wasn't just trying to eliminate a loose end, they were trying to destroy the last witness to a conspiracy that was probably still active. Parker might be dead by now, but the network he'd served could still be operating, still selling American secrets and getting American soldiers killed. "We need to get this evidence to someone who can use it," he told Bandit, as they prepared to leave the cave. Matthews, Rodriguez, Thompson, they deserve justice, even if it's 20 years late. But first, they needed to survive long enough to deliver that justice. The helicopters were getting closer, their rotor wash creating miniature blizzards in the thin mountain air. Thermal imaging would make concealment nearly impossible, and Jed's aging body couldn't sustain the kind of evasive maneuvering that had kept them alive so far. That's when Bandit did something that reminded Jed why military working dogs were considered force multipliers rather than just companions. The dog moved to a specific section of the cave wall and began pawing at what looked like solid rock. When Jed investigated, he found another hidden cache, this one containing communication equipment and detailed maps of the surrounding area. The maps showed safe houses, supply drops, and extraction points that his younger self had established as backup plans. Operation Whiteout might have failed, but the man who'd planned it had been thorough enough to prepare for multiple contingencies. Looking at those maps, Jed realized that his amnesia had been both a curse and a blessing. It had hidden the evidence from his enemies, but it had also hidden his own preparations from himself. Now, with his tactical memory returning, he had resources his pursuers didn't know existed. The hunt was far from over, but the hunted was becoming the hunter again. The silver compass felt warm in Jed's palm, despite the mountain cold, its weight familiar in a way that spoke to years of dependence. As he turned it over, the inscription on the back brought another surge of memory. To my most trusted sergeant, find your way home, D. Matthews, March 2003. Matthews had given him this compass just before Operation Whiteout, a gesture that had seemed like simple military courtesy at the time. But now, studying the device more carefully, Jed realized it was far more than a standard-issue navigation tool. The compass face bore subtle markings that weren't part of the original manufacturing coordinates, etched so faintly they were barely visible unless you knew to look for them. He knew something was wrong. Jed murmured to Bandit as they huddled in the shelter of a rock overhang. Matthews suspected the mission was compromised, so he gave us a backup plan. The coordinates led to a location 15 miles northeast of their current position, a difficult journey through hostile terrain, but not impossible for someone with Jed's training. What made it particularly challenging was the fact that their pursuers now had air support, making movement during daylight hours extremely dangerous. But it was the helicopter activity that revealed something crucial about their enemies' capabilities. Jed had been counting rotors, tracking flight patterns, and what he discovered made his blood run cold. The aircraft overhead weren't standard military transports. They were civilian contractors using equipment that belonged to a private military company. "This isn't an official operation, boy," he told Bandit as another helicopter passed overhead. "Someone's using mercenaries to clean up their mess." The implications were staggering. If the conspiracy behind Operation Whiteout was still active after 20 years, it had grown far beyond a simple case of military corruption. Private military companies required serious funding and high-level political protection. The people who wanted him dead weren't just covering up an old betrayal, they were protecting an ongoing criminal enterprise. As they waited for darkness before making their move toward Matthews' coordinates, Jed found his tactical memory continuing to reassemble itself. The process was painful, like bones knitting back together after a complex break, but each recovered fragment made him more formidable. He remembered how to read terrain for defensive advantages, how to set improvised explosive devices using common materials, how to turn his environment into a weapon against better-equipped enemies. Most importantly, he remembered how to think like Lieutenant Colonel Matthews, a commander who always planned 3 moves ahead and never left his people without options. When full darkness finally arrived, Jed and Bandit began their careful journey toward the coordinates. The dog's night vision and acute hearing made him an invaluable early warning system, while Jed's returning knowledge of mountain warfare kept them invisible to the thermal imaging systems sweeping the area. It took them 6 hours of careful movement to reach Matthews' coordinates, avoiding 2-foot patrols and staying well clear of the helicopter search patterns. What they found when they arrived was another testament to Matthew's foresight and preparation. The location was an abandoned mining claim that appeared completely unremarkable from the surface, but following the compass directions precisely led them to a concealed entrance that opened into a natural cave system. Inside, Matthews had established what could only be described as a complete backup command center. "Jesus, Matthews," Jed whispered as he surveyed the hidden facility. "You really were planning for everything." The cave contained enough supplies for a small unit to operate independently for months. Food, water, ammunition, medical equipment, and communication gear, all of it carefully preserved and maintained. But it was the intelligence materials that revealed the true scope of Matthew's preparation. Wall charts showed the complete organizational structure of Operation Whiteout, including communication protocols, supply chains, and personnel files. But more importantly, they showed alternative networks that Matthews had suspected of corruption. Parker's name appeared on multiple charts, connected by red lines to other names that made Jed's heart race. Colonel Richard Hawkins, their division commander. General Patricia Morrison, who had authorized the mission. Deputy Director James Fletcher from the Defense Intelligence Agency. All of them connected in a web of relationships and financial transactions that painted a picture of systemic corruption reaching to the highest levels of military and intelligence leadership. Matthews knew, Jed said, studying the charts with growing amazement. He knew the whole thing was rotten, and he was building a case against them. But the most stunning discovery was in Matthews' personal files. The lieutenant colonel had been conducting his own investigation into the plutonium sales network, using his position and clearance to gather evidence of treason that went far beyond Operation Whiteout. What Dr. Volkov had offered wasn't just intelligence about weapons sales, it was corroboration of evidence that Matthews had been collecting for years. The conspiracy wasn't just about money or ideology, it was about power. A network of military and intelligence officials had been systematically selling American secrets to foreign powers, using the profits to fund black operations that served their own interests rather than national security. Operation Whiteout had been compromised because success would have exposed their entire enterprise. As Jed studied Matthews' files, fragments of conversations began returning to his memory. Late-night discussions about discrepancies in weapons inventories, questions about mission authorizations that didn't follow proper channels. Matthews' growing suspicion that they were being used as pawns in someone else's game. "He tried to warn us," Jed said, his voice heavy with emotion. In his own way, Matthews was trying to tell us that we were walking into a trap. Bandit's sudden alertness pulled Jed back to the present. The dog's ears were pricked toward the cave entrance, his body tense with warning. Outside, the sound of approaching voices carried on the night air. Their pursuers had found the trail again, or perhaps they'd always known about this location. But this time, Jed wasn't planning to run. Matthews had left him more than just supplies and intelligence. He'd left him the tools to fight back. And after 20 years of living with gaps in his memory, 20 years of not understanding why he felt like a stranger in his own life, Jed was ready to honor his fallen commander's sacrifice. The compass in his hand seemed to pulse with warmth, as if Matthews himself were providing guidance one final time. The coordinates had led him to evidence, but they'd also led him to a choice. He could continue running, protecting himself and Bandit, while letting the conspiracy that had killed his teammates continue to operate. Or he could remember that he'd once been a soldier, sworn to defend his country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Looking into Bandit's intelligent eyes, Jed made his decision. They weren't running anymore. They were going to finish what Matthews had started, no matter the cost. The leather journal fell open in Jed's hands, as if it had been waiting 20 years for this moment. His own handwriting stared back at him from pages yellowed with age, but the words were written in a code so complex that it took several minutes for his memory to supply the decryption key. When it did, the secrets locked within those pages threatened to destroy everything he thought he understood about his own life. The 10th of March, 2003, he read aloud, his voice barely audible in the hidden cave. Suspect Parker receiving external communications. Radio protocols violated twice this week. Matthews shares concerns but orders. Continued observation. The journal entries painted a picture of growing suspicion and mounting evidence that Operation Whiteout was doomed before it began. But it was the personal entries that hit Jed like physical blows, revealing truths that his amnesia had mercifully concealed. Sarah called again, told her I can't discuss timeline for coming home. Emma's science fair is next week, promised to be back for Christmas presentation if possible. This mission feels wrong, but duty comes first. Always comes first. Sarah, Emma. The names exploded through his consciousness like grenades, bringing with them a cascade of memories that 20 years of suppression couldn't completely erase. His wife's laugh, his daughter's gap-toothed smile. The house in Colorado Springs where they'd planned to grow old together. Bandit whined softly and pressed against Jed's leg, sensing the emotional storm raging within his handler. The dog had been there for it all, the marriage, the birth of his daughter, the gradual strain that military life had placed on their family. And Bandit had been there when Jed made the most difficult decision of his life. The 14th of March, 2003. He continued reading, his hands trembling. Met with DIA psychiatrist Dr. Reynolds. Discussed memory suppression protocol as alternative to witness protection. If mission is compromised as suspected, Sarah and Emma will be safer believing I died in action rather than living with constant threat of retaliation. Bandit will be reassigned to assist in my recovery and eventual reintegration. The words swam before his eyes as the full scope of his sacrifice became clear. He hadn't lost his memory due to trauma, he had voluntarily surrendered it to protect his family. The man he'd been had chosen to become a ghost rather than expose his wife and daughter to the people who had murdered his teammates. I let them think I was dead, he whispered, the weight of that choice crushing down on him like an avalanche. For 20 years, Sarah and Emma believed I was killed in action because I thought it would keep them safe. But the journal revealed that even this ultimate sacrifice had been based on incomplete information. In the final entries, written during his recovery period before the memory suppression took effect, Jed had discovered something that changed everything. The 20th of March 2003, he read, Dr. Reynolds confirmed memory suppression is not therapeutic procedure but part of active cover-up. Parker's handlers want all evidence buried, including witness testimony. Choice is die or disappear. Choose disappearance, but suspect even this will not be permanent solution. They will come eventually. Bandit's sudden alertness pulled Jed's attention away from the journal. Outside the cave, the sound of approaching helicopters was getting louder, accompanied by the voices of ground teams coordinating their search. But this time, instead of fear, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years: cold, focused rage. They had stolen everything from him. His memory, his identity, his family. They had murdered his teammates and then forced him to abandon everyone he loved to protect them from retaliation. And now, when he was finally beginning to remember who he'd been, they wanted to finish the job they'd started 2 decades ago. As Jed rapidly gathered the most crucial intelligence materials from Matthew's cache, his tactical mind began working through possibilities that would have been unthinkable hours earlier. The people hunting him expected to find a confused old man with gaps in his memory. They weren't prepared to face a special forces operator who remembered his training and had nothing left to lose. Time to remind them who we used to be. Boy, he told Bandit as he checked the action on an M4 carbine that felt perfectly familiar in his hands. The cave system had multiple exits, and Matthews had prepared defensive positions at each one. Claymore mines, improvised explosive devices, overlapping fields of fire that could turn the entire area into a killing ground. Jed's younger self had helped design these defenses, and now his older self was going to use them. But it was the communication equipment that offered the most promising option for changing the dynamic of their situation. Among Matthew's gear was a secure satellite phone with encryption protocols that bypassed normal military channels. More importantly, it had the contact information for people Matthews had trusted: journalists, investigators, and honest military officers who had been excluded from the conspiracy. "If we're going to die tonight," Jed said as he powered up the communication system, "we're going to make sure the truth dies with us." The first call went to Amanda Walsh, an investigative journalist who had been working on a story about missing plutonium when Operation Whiteout went bad. The second went to General Robert Carey, a man Matthews had trusted implicitly and who had been mysteriously reassigned immediately after questioning the official story of the mission's failure. To each of them, Jed transmitted the location coordinates of Matthew's cache and a brief explanation of what they would find there. If the cleanup crew succeeded in killing him tonight, the evidence would still survive. His teammates' deaths would finally be avenged, and his family would learn that their husband and father had died trying to serve his country honorably. But as he prepared for what might be his final battle, Jed realized he didn't want to die with Sarah and Emma still believing he was a memory from their distant past. The journal had revealed phone numbers, addresses, details about their lives that his conscious mind had forgotten, but his heart had preserved. One final call, this time to a number in Colorado Springs that he prayed would still be active after 20 years. "Hello?" The voice was older, more cautious than he remembered, but unmistakably Sarah's. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Sarah, it's me. It's Jed." The silence on the other end stretched for eternity before she whispered, "That's impossible. You died 20 years ago." "I know what you were told," he said as the sound of approaching enemies grew louder outside the cave. "But I'm alive, and there's something you need to know about why I disappeared." He had maybe 5 minutes before the assault began. 5 minutes to explain 20 years of lies and sacrifice. 5 minutes to tell his wife and daughter that he had never stopped loving them, even when he couldn't remember their names. Outside, Bandit had taken position at the main entrance, ready to defend his handler one final time. Inside, Jed gripped the phone and began to tell his family the truth they deserved to hear. The wedding ring was hidden in a compartment so secret that even Jed's returning memories hadn't revealed its location. It was Bandit who found it, pawing insistently at what appeared to be solid rock until Jed realized the dog was indicating another of Matthew's concealed caches. When the hidden panel slid aside, revealing the small velvet box within, Jed's world tilted on its axis once again. Inside the ring were inscriptions that made his hands shake as he read them. "To my beloved Jed, forever yours, Sarah, the 15th of December, 1995. But it was the note wrapped around the ring that delivered the devastating truth he'd never suspected. If you're reading this, the memory suppression has been reversed, and you remember choosing to disappear. What you don't remember is that Sarah agreed to the deception. She knew you were alive. She helped plan your disappearance because we discovered something that changed everything. Emma is not your biological daughter, but she doesn't know it. Sarah was pregnant when you met, running from Emma's real father, a man who would have killed both of them if he'd found them. Your death wasn't just to protect them from your enemies. It was to protect Emma from hers. D. Matthews. Jed sank against the cave wall, the ring clutching in his trembling fingers as memories flooded back with sickening clarity. Sarah, 8 months pregnant, when they'd met at a coffee shop near Fort Carson. Her nervousness, her reluctance to talk about the baby's father, the way she'd flinched whenever anyone in uniform approached their table. Emma's real father was Colonel Viktor Kozlov, a Russian intelligence officer who had been running a deep-cover operation in the United States. Sarah had been his unwitting asset until she discovered his true identity and the danger he represented. She'd fled with nothing but the child growing inside her, desperately seeking protection from anyone who could help. Jed had fallen in love with both of them instantly. When he'd married Sarah 6 months later, he'd adopted Emma as his own and never looked back. But Matthews's note revealed a truth that even his recovered memories couldn't access. Kozlov had found them. December 2002, the note continued. Kozlov traced Sarah and Emma to Colorado Springs. He wants his daughter and will kill anyone who stands in his way. Sarah confessed everything when my security team detected Russian surveillance on your family. The memory suppression isn't just about Operation Whiteout, it's about creating a complete new identity that Kozlov can't trace. As far as the world knows, Jed Crowther died in Afghanistan. The man you become after the procedure will have no connection to Sarah or Emma, keeping them safe from both your enemies and theirs. The sound of Sarah's voice on the satellite phone suddenly took on new meaning. She hadn't been shocked because she thought he was dead. She'd been shocked because his reappearance meant the carefully constructed deception was crumbling, exposing Emma to danger once again. "Oh God," Jed whispered, understanding flooding through him like ice water. "The cleanup crew isn't just here for me. They're here for information about Sarah and Emma." Bandit's warning bark confirmed his worst fears. Outside the cave, voices were approaching with tactical precision, but Jed could hear something in their coordination that he'd missed before: a slight accent, subtle pronunciation patterns that spoke of foreign training. These weren't American mercenaries. They were Russian operatives, probably working for the same intelligence network that Kozlov had served. And if they'd found him, it was only a matter of time before they found his family. The realization transformed everything about Jed's tactical situation. This wasn't just about exposing a 20-year-old conspiracy or getting justice for his fallen teammates. This was about protecting a daughter who didn't even know she was his daughter from a father who would destroy her life to reclaim what he considered his property. As Jed quickly reviewed Matthews's intelligence files with this new understanding, connections became clear that had been invisible before. Operation Whiteout hadn't just been compromised by American traitors, it had been a joint operation designed to eliminate both Dr. Volkov and anyone who knew about Kozlov's American activities. Parker's betrayal hadn't been about money or ideology. He'd been compromised by Russian intelligence through his gambling debts and extortion. The weapons sales network was real, but it was being used as cover for a much more sophisticated intelligence operation designed to identify and eliminate Russian defectors and their American protectors. "They played us all," Jed said, his voice harsh with understanding. "Volkov, Matthews, me, we were all just pieces on Kozlov's chessboard." But the wedding ring in his hand represented something that Kozlov hadn't anticipated. The love between Jed and Sarah hadn't been part of anyone's operational plan. Emma's adoption hadn't been a cover story. It had been a choice made by two people who had found something worth protecting in each other. The satellite phone crackled to life with an incoming transmission. When Jed answered, Sarah's voice was tight with controlled panic. "Jed, you have to listen to me. There are men watching our house. Emma's at college, but they're asking questions about you, about our marriage. They know you're alive. Sarah, I need you to get to a safe location immediately. Follow the emergency protocols we discussed before." "Before what, Jed? Before you died? Before you disappeared? I've been living a lie for 20 years, and I don't even know which protocols you're talking about." The confusion in her voice reminded Jed that his memories were returning faster than hers, were adjusting to his resurrection. For her, he'd been dead for 2 decades. The emergency plans they'd made, the contingencies Matthews had helped them establish, all of that belonged to a life she'd been forced to forget. "Listen to me," he said, his voice, taking on the command authority that had once led soldiers into combat. "Pack 1 bag with essentials. Get in your car and drive to the cabin where we spent our first anniversary. Do you remember that place?" "The cabin in... Yes, I remember. But Jed, what's happening? Who are these people? They're connected to Emma's biological father. The same people who've been hunting me are now hunting you and Emma because they think you have information about Russian intelligence operations. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched painfully before Sarah whispered, "Victor found us, didn't he? After all these years, he found us. I'm not going to let him hurt you or Emma," Jed said, checking his weapons one final time. "But I need you to trust me one more time, even though I know I haven't earned that right." "You earned it 20 years ago when you chose to protect us," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "And you're earning it again right now." Outside the cave, the Russian operatives were positioning themselves for an assault. But their presence had confirmed something crucial. This operation wasn't just about eliminating a witness to past crimes. It was about controlling the future, about ensuring that Kozlov's network could continue operating without interference from people who knew too much. As Jed prepared for the coming battle, the wedding ring seemed to burn in his pocket like a promise he'd made decades ago and was finally ready to keep. Emma might not be his biological daughter, but she was his daughter in every way that mattered. And no one, not Kozlov, not his operatives, not the entire Russian intelligence apparatus, was going to take his family away from him again. The twist had changed everything, but it had also clarified everything. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about protecting the future and about proving that some bonds are stronger than blood, stronger than memory, and stronger than the lies that people tell to tear families apart. Bandit took position at his side, ready for whatever came next. Together, they'd survived 20 years of separation, amnesia, and deception. Now they were going to find out if they could survive the truth. The tactical map spread across the cave floor looked like a battlefield commander's nightmare and a guerrilla fighter's dream. Jed's hands moved with practiced precision as he marked enemy positions, calculated fields of fire, and planned what military strategists euphemistically called multiple contingency scenarios. In plain language, he was preparing to kill as many Russian operatives as possible before they killed him. Through the night vision scope, he could count at least 12 hostiles moving into position around the cave system. Professional soldiers moving with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke to extensive training and combat experience. But they were making the same mistake that had cost American forces so dearly 20 years. They were underestimating their opponent. They think they're hunting a confused old man. Jed whispered to Bandit as he checked the detonation sequence for the Claymore mines Matthews had positioned throughout the approach routes. They have no idea they're walking into the same kind of trap that made their predecessors famous in Afghanistan. Bandit's response was to move to his assigned position near the cave's secondary entrance, his body language shifting into the focused alertness of a military working dog preparing for combat. Whatever physical effects had nearly killed him during the blizzard were completely gone now, replaced by the kind of tactical awareness that had made him invaluable during Special Forces operations. The satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from Sarah. Reached the cabin. 2 cars followed me but turned back at County Road. Emma's safe at university, but asking questions about news reports of helicopter activity in the mountains. What do I tell her? Jed typed back quickly. Tell her the truth. She's old enough to understand that her safety depends on staying hidden until this is over. Does she still have the emergency contact procedures we established? The response came immediately. What emergency procedures? Jed, I've been living with the belief that you died in combat. There are 20 years of conversations we never had, 20 years of plans we never made. The reminder hit him like a physical blow. His recovered memories included detailed contingency plans that he and Sarah had developed before his disappearance, but from her perspective, those plans belonged to a different life, a different version of the man she'd married. The psychological impact of his resurrection was creating tactical vulnerabilities that their enemies could exploit. As he worked through the communication challenge, Jed's mind processed the larger strategic picture with the kind of analytical thinking that had made him valuable to Special Forces Command. Kozlov's operatives had found him through patience and systematic investigation, probably triggered by the renewed interest in Operation Whiteout that his reappearance had generated. But their timing suggested something more immediate than a 20-year vendetta. The answer came to him with chilling clarity as he reviewed Matthews's intelligence files. Emma was 21 years old, the same age as the daughter Kozlov had never been allowed to claim. And according to Sarah's messages, Emma was asking questions about the unusual military activity in her home region. "They're not just here to eliminate me," he realized, speaking aloud to organize his thoughts. "They're here because Kozlov wants to make contact with Emma before she learns the truth about her parentage." The tactical implications were staggering. If Kozlov's goal was to establish a relationship with his daughter rather than simply eliminate threats to his operation, then killing Jed was only part of a larger plan. The Russian operative would want to present himself as Emma's rescuer, the biological father who had finally tracked down his stolen child and eliminated the American soldiers who had kept them apart. It was a narrative that would appeal to a young woman who had grown up believing her adoptive father was a war hero killed in combat. Kozlov could position himself as the victim of American intelligence operations, forced to watch his daughter from a distance while enemy agents prevented their reunion. "Psychological warfare," Jed muttered, appreciating the sophistication of the plan even as it filled him with rage. "He's not just hunting us, he's preparing to recruit Emma by making himself look like the victim." The realization changed everything about Jed's tactical priorities. Killing Kozlov's operatives wouldn't solve the problem if the man himself was safely positioned to approach Emma with a carefully constructed story about her true parentage. Jed needed to not just survive the current assault, he needed to reach Emma before Kozlov could poison her mind with lies wrapped around carefully selected truths. But first, he had to deal with 12 trained killers who were probably less than 10 minutes away from beginning their assault on the cave system. Moving with the kind of controlled urgency that separated professional soldiers from amateur enthusiasts, Jed began activating the defensive systems that his younger self had helped Matthews install. Pressure plates connected to explosive devices, tripwires linked to flares that would illuminate target areas, and carefully positioned claymore mines that could turn narrow passages into killing zones. The beauty of Matthews's defensive plan was that it didn't require holding static positions against superior numbers. Instead, it was designed to channel attackers into predetermined kill zones while providing multiple escape routes for the defenders. Classic guerrilla warfare principles adapted to mountainous terrain and executed with military-grade equipment. As Jed moved through the final preparation sequence, fragments of tactical knowledge continued to surface from his recovered memories. How to use audio deception to mask movement patterns. How to exploit natural acoustics to amplify the psychological impact of explosions. How to coordinate with Bandit using hand signals that would be invisible to enemies using night vision equipment. "Just like old times, boy," he whispered to the dog as they took position for the opening phase of the engagement. But it wasn't just like old times, and Jed knew it. 20 years ago, he'd been fighting for mission objectives and unit cohesion, abstract concepts that motivated professional soldiers. Tonight, he was fighting for Emma's future and Sarah's safety, personal stakes that made him both more dangerous and more vulnerable than he'd ever been in combat. The first explosion shook the cave system as lead elements of the Tentin. Assault team triggered one of the outer perimeter devices. Shouts in Russian echoed through the mountain air, followed by the distinctive sound of tactical communication radios crackling with urgent status reports. "Alpha Team, report status." Was that contact or explosive device? Explosive device. "We have 2 casualties, both ambulatory. Continuing approach. Be advised, target may be more formidable than intelligence indicated. Proceed with enhanced caution." Enhanced caution. Jed almost smiled at the military euphemism. His enemies were discovering that their intelligence about a confused amnesia victim had been dangerously incomplete. but their continued advance indicated that they were committed to completing their mission regardless of casualties. Through the periscope system, Jed watched the assault teams adjust their approach patterns to account for the defensive obstacles. Professional adaptation, but not fast enough to prevent the second wave of explosions that erupted as additional teams triggered mines positioned along the most obvious infiltration routes. Beta team, we need immediate fire support on that cave entrance. Target is using prepared positions. Roger, Alpha, bringing up the heavy weapons. Heavy weapons, that changed the tactical equation significantly. Jed had planned for small arms engagement and basic explosives, but if Kozlov's operatives had brought rocket-propelled grenades or similar ordnance, the cave's defensive advantages would quickly become death traps. Time to implement Phase 2 of Matthew's plan. Bandit, exfiltration route 3, he commanded, pointing toward the concealed tunnel that led to a position above and behind the assault team's current positions. The dog immediately began moving toward their escape route, but his posture indicated continued readiness for combat. Bandit understood that this wasn't a retreat, it was a tactical repositioning designed to turn the hunters into the hunted. As they moved through the tunnel system, Jed activated the final surprise that Matthews had prepared for anyone foolish enough to assault the cave complex. Remote detonation charges placed throughout the main cavern, designed to create the impression of a catastrophic collapse while actually sealing off sections of the cave for later use. The explosions that followed were tremendous, shaking the entire mountain and sending plumes of dust and debris into the night air. To the assault teams outside, it would appear that their heavy weapons had succeeded in bringing down the cave system, probably killing anyone inside. What they wouldn't realize until too late was that Jed and Bandit were now positioned behind them, with clear fields of fire and detailed knowledge of their movement patterns. The hunt was about to become very personal indeed. The sniper scope felt like an extension of Jed's soul as he settled into firing position on the ridge above the cave complex. 20 years of amnesia couldn't erase the kind of muscle memory that had made him one of the most feared marksmen in Special Forces history. The familiar weight of the rifle, the precise adjustment of the scope's elevation, the controlled breathing that would steady his aim, all of it returned with deadly precision. Through the scope's crosshairs, he could see the Russian assault team regrouping after the cave explosions, their tactical formation revealing both professional competence and fatal overconfidence. They believed their target was buried under tons of rock and debris, which made them careless about their positioning and communication security. 12 hostiles confirmed, he whispered to Bandit, who had taken position as his spotter and early warning system. Squad leaders at 2 and 10 o'clock, heavy weapons team centered on the main approach. Standard Spetsnaz formation, adapted for mountain warfare. The dog's ears twitched in acknowledgement, his attention focused on the approach routes that could bring additional enemies toward their position. Bandit's tactical awareness was extraordinary. He could distinguish between natural wildlife movement and human activity with an accuracy that surpassed most electronic surveillance systems. As Jed studied the enemy formation through his scope, he identified the assault team leader by his position and communication patterns. A tall man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command, probably a colonel or lieutenant colonel, based on how the other operatives deferred to his hand signals. But it was when the man removed his night vision goggles to study the cave complex that Jed's blood turned to ice. The face in his crosshairs belonged to Colonel Viktor Kozlov himself. "Son of a bitch came personally," Jed muttered, his finger moving instinctively toward the trigger before tactical discipline reasserted itself. Killing Kozlov would eliminate the immediate threat to Emma, but it would also trigger a response from the remaining operatives that could compromise his own survival. Through his earpiece, Jed could hear fragments of the Russian communications as they coordinated their next phase of operations. His facility with languages, another skill that had survived his amnesia, allowed him to understand their tactical discussions. Search Team Alpha, begin excavation of primary entrance. If the target survived the collapse, he will attempt to emerge through debris field. Search Team Beta established perimeter watch on secondary positions. Target demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of defensive systems. Command Team, prepare extraction helicopter for Phase 2 operations. Timeline for Colorado objectives remains unchanged. Colorado objectives. They were planning to move against Sarah and Emma regardless of whether they found Jed's body in the cave ruins. The realization crystallized his tactical priorities. He couldn't just survive this engagement, he had to eliminate the entire assault team to protect his family. Moving with the patience that separated professional snipers from eager amateurs, Jed began calculating range, windage, and target priority. The heavy weapons team posed the greatest immediate threat to his position, but taking them out first would alert the others to his survival. Better to start with the perimeter guards, working inward toward the command group while maintaining the element of surprise. His first shot took the northernmost sentry through the head at a range of 300 meters, the suppressed rifle producing only a whisper of sound that was masked by wind through the mountain peaks. The man dropped silently, his absence unnoticed by teammates focused on the cave excavation. The second shot eliminated the southern perimeter guard 15 seconds later, creating a gap in their defensive coverage that would allow Jed to reposition if necessary. But it was the third shot that announced his presence to the surviving operatives, a careful shot that disabled the heavy weapon system by destroying its optical sights and leaving the gunner alive, but effectively blinded. Sniper! Sniper on the ridge! All units take cover and begin suppression fire. The response was immediate and professional, with the remaining operatives diving for whatever cover the rocky terrain provided, while their communications specialist began calling for backup support. But their training, excellent as it was for urban or jungle warfare, was insufficient for the kind of mountain combat that Jed had mastered over decades of special forces operations. From his elevated position, Jed could see movement patterns that were invisible to ground-level combatants. When two operatives attempted to flank his position by moving through what appeared to be concealed terrain, he was ready with shots that eliminated them before they could establish firing positions. But it was Kozlov's reaction that impressed Jed despite himself. Rather than seeking cover like his subordinates, the Russian colonel began moving tactically toward a position that would allow him to coordinate a more effective response. The man was clearly a combat veteran, someone who understood that defensive reactions would only delay the inevitable against a skilled marksman in prepared positions. "You want to play chess, Victor?" Jed whispered as he tracked the colonel through his scope. "Let's see how good you really are." The psychological warfare was beginning in earnest now, a deadly game between two experienced operators who understood that victory would go to whoever could outthink his opponent. But as Jed prepared for the next phase of the engagement, Bandit's warning growl alerted him to movement behind their position. Additional hostiles, probably a reserve team that had remained hidden during the initial assault. The tactical situation was becoming more complex, but Jed's determination was becoming stronger. These people had threatened his daughter and terrorized his wife. They were about to learn why that was a fatal mistake. The unit patch from Jed's old uniform had survived 20 years of hiding in the deepest pocket of his field jacket. The fabric faded, but the meaning as sharp as the day he'd first earned the right to wear it. As bullets snapped overhead and Kozlov's remaining operatives closed in from multiple directions, Jed touched the patch like a talisman, remembering the oath he'd taken to protect innocent lives regardless of personal cost. The reserve team that Bandit had detected consisted of 4 additional operatives moving up the mountain with professional skill, using natural cover and coordinated fire to pin down Jed's position while Kozlov organized a frontal assault. They were good, very good, but they were also making the classic mistake of assuming their opponent was operating alone. What they didn't know was that Matthew's defensive preparations included more than just explosive devices and prepared firing positions. Hidden caches throughout the mountain contained remotely activated systems that could turn the entire area into a coordinated killing zone, controlled by a single operator who knew the activation codes. "Bandit, Cache 7, Jed whispered, pointing toward a concealed position that would give the dog access to one of Matthew's secondary weapons systems. The dog immediately understood, moving with the fluid precision of countless training exercises as he activated a mechanism that had been waiting 20 years for this moment. The result was a series of coordinated explosions that eliminated the flanking team while simultaneously creating a smokescreen that masked Jed's movement to a new firing position. Through the chaos, Kozlov's voice could be heard shouting orders in Russian, his tone revealing both professional frustration and personal anger. The colonel was beginning to understand that he wasn't facing a confused amnesia victim, but rather a fully operational Special Forces soldier who had home field advantage on terrain. He'd helped prepare for exactly this kind of engagement. All units concentrate fire on grid reference 7-7 Alpha. Target is using prepared positions, so we neutralize the positions themselves. The response was immediate and devastating. The remaining operatives began firing rocket-propelled grenades at every potential hiding spot on the ridge, systematically destroying cover that had taken years to develop. It was effective tactics, but it was also exactly what Jed had been waiting for. As the explosions erupted around his former position, Jed had already moved to the location where Kozlov would be forced to position himself to coordinate the bombardment. The Russian colonel was excellent at tactical thinking, but he was operating from doctrine that assumed his opponent would remain in static defensive positions. The shot that ended the engagement was taken from a range of less than 50 meters, close enough to see Kozlov's expression of surprised recognition in the moment before the bullet found its target. The colonel had finally realized he was facing the same soldier who had survived Operation Whiteout, but the realization came too late to save his life. The remaining operatives fought with the desperation of men who understood their situation was hopeless, but without Kozlov's leadership, they devolved into individual survival rather than coordinated tactics. Jed and Bandit eliminated them systematically, using the mountain terrain and prepared positions to turn what should have been a disadvantaged engagement into a tactical masterpiece. When silence finally returned to the mountain, Jed found himself standing over Kozlov's body with emotions he couldn't easily categorize. Relief that the threat to Emma was ended. Satisfaction that justice had been served for his murdered teammates. But also sadness for the waste of it all. The lives lost, the years stolen, the families destroyed, by men who viewed human beings as disposable assets in their games of power and ideology. The unit patch in his pocket represented something that transcended national boundaries or political loyalties. It represented the commitment to protect innocent people from those who would harm them, regardless of the personal cost. 20 years ago, that commitment had cost him his memory and his family. Tonight, it had cost 12 Russian operatives their lives, but as he began the process of securing the area and contacting backup support, Jed realized the real battle was just beginning. Emma still didn't know the truth about her parentage. Sarah still believed she was a widow, rather than the wife of a man who had sacrificed everything to protect their family. And somewhere in the intelligence networks of both nations, other people would soon learn that the Operation Whiteout conspiracy had been exposed. The satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from Sarah. Military helicopters, approaching the cabin. "Are these your people or his people?" Jed smiled grimly as he typed his response. "Mine." "It's over, Sarah. The threat to Emma is eliminated. But there's still a lot we need to talk about." Her reply came immediately. 20 years' worth of conversation. I think we can handle it. Looking down at Bandit, who was already moving to secure the weapons and intelligence materials they'd recovered from the assault team, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in decades: hope for the future. The war was over. Now they could finally begin the peace. The new collar was simple brown leather, without the embedded technology or military markings that had defined Bandit's previous life. As Jed fastened it around his companion's neck 6 months after the events on the mountain, both man and dog understood what the gesture represented: freedom from the shadows of war and the right to live without constantly looking over their shoulders. "No more missions, boy," Jed said softly, scratching behind Bandit's ears in the way that had always brought the dog comfort. "No more codes, no more cover identities, no more hunting and being hunted, just us, being ourselves." They were standing on the porch of the cabin in Colorado that had once served as Sarah and Emma's emergency safe house, but which was now simply home. The same cabin where Sarah had fled after receiving Jed's warning about Kozlov's operatives, but which had been transformed in the months since into something none of them had dared hope for: a place where a family could rebuild itself after 20 years of enforced separation. The investigation that followed the mountain battle had vindicated everything Matthews had suspected and more. Congressional hearings had exposed the weapons sales network, resulting in the arrests of 17 current and former military officials. The Russian intelligence operation that Kozlov had been running was dismantled, with several diplomatic expulsions, and the closure of 3 front companies that had been operating on American soil. But for Jed, the most important outcome had been much more personal. The official recognition that Sergeant First Class Jed Crowther had been operating under deep cover for national security purposes rather than deserting his post or abandoning his family. The military honors that had been posthumously awarded 20 years earlier were quietly transferred to living recipient status, along with the back pay and benefits that Sarah had been denied during her supposed widowhood. Emma had taken the revelations about her parentage with a maturity that amazed both her parents. At 21, she was old enough to understand the complexities of the situation and wise enough to recognize that biology mattered far less than the love and sacrifice that had shaped her upbringing. "I always wondered why I felt so safe as a child," she'd told Jed during their first long conversation after his return. "Now, I understand that it was because you and Mom had planned for every possible threat, even the ones that seemed unthinkable." The relationship between Jed and Sarah had required more careful rebuilding. 20 years of grief, followed by the shock of resurrection, couldn't be erased by explanations or apologies. But they'd approached it with the same patience and determination that had allowed them to survive the original crisis, taking time to rediscover each other while acknowledging how much both of them had changed. "We're not the same people who fell in love 25 years ago," Sarah had said during one of their evening walks around the cabin property. "But I think I like who we've become even more." The hardest part had been dealing with the psychological aftermath of the memory recovery. Jed's amnesia had protected him from the trauma of losing his teammates, but remembering their deaths had brought a survivor's guilt that no amount of tactical success could completely heal. It was Bandit who had provided the key insight during one of Jed's darker moments. The dog had brought him one of Matthew's old field manuals, dropping it at his feet with the kind of deliberate intent that spoke to canine wisdom. Inside, Jed had found a handwritten note from his former commanding officer. "The best way to honor the dead is to protect the living. Remember that when the nightmares come." Matthews had understood, even 20 years ago, that survival would bring its own burdens. But he'd also understood that those burdens were worth bearing if they allowed good people to live free from the threats that evil men created. The government had offered Jed various positions in intelligence and military advisory roles. Recognizing that his unique experience and proven capabilities could be valuable in ongoing operations against foreign infiltration networks, he'd declined them all. After decades of service and sacrifice, he'd earned the right to choose family over duty, for once in his life. Instead, he'd accepted a position with the local sheriff's department as a training coordinator for tactical operations. It allowed him to use his skills in service of his community while staying close to home, and it provided the kind of purposeful work that prevented the restlessness that often affected retired Special Forces operators. Bandit had adapted to civilian life, with the same professionalism he'd brought to military operations. The dog still maintained his alertness and physical conditioning, but his protective instincts were now focused on grandchildren rather than classified missions. Emma's 2-year-old son had become Bandit's primary responsibility, a role the dog approached with the same dedication he'd once brought to protecting soldiers in combat zones. As the sun set behind the Colorado mountains on this particular evening, Jed reflected on the strange paths that life could take. 20 years ago, he'd believed he was sacrificing his future to protect his family. In reality, he'd been preserving it, ensuring that they could all reach this moment when the threats were eliminated and the choices were their own. The simple leather collar around Bandit's neck represented more than the end of their military service. It represented the beginning of the life they'd always deserved, but never dared hope for a life where love mattered more than duty, where family came before mission objectives, and where 2 old soldiers could finally rest in the knowledge that their long war was truly over. "Come on, boy," Jed said as Sarah's voice called them in for dinner. Time to go home. For the first time in decades, home wasn't a location they were protecting or an identity they were maintaining. It was simply the place where the people they loved were waiting for them, and where tomorrow held nothing more dangerous than the ordinary blessings of family life. It was everything they'd ever fought for, and everything they'd finally earned the right to keep.